Bett is the global meeting place for the education community. A trusted brand with more than 30 years of heritage, the Bett series promotes the discovery of knowledge and technology to enhance lifelong learning. The Bett series attracts over 60,000 educators, leaders and practitioners, alongside more than 1,250 technology providers from around the globe. For more information, go to www.bettshow.com/bet-global-series.
Given the opportunity, all children are geniuses in their own right. And to me, children, they're born curious, and the biggest challenge we all have is to work together to ensure that they stay curious. And when they are, then I think we know our job is done. The problem is many of the structures we have tends to kill that curiosity. So that's something that we have to keep alive, and hopefully Edtech can help do that.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the newest episode of a brand new What Matters in Edtech series, this time with a focus on all things global and co-curated as ever by our friends at Bett. This series is all about the things that matter in education and how and when tech might help, and this first episode looks at the Asia region. First of all, these are unprecedented times, as we've heard so often lately. Coronavirus is changing how we work, how we learn, how we teach, and how we stay in touch with loved ones. If you're listening to this now, near the time of recording, you'll hear from educators and tech specialists from around the world sharing how they have coped with moving online or embedding practices online. If you're listening in when all this is over, hopefully, we hope that we can come out the other side more compassionate, more connected, and more appreciative of our face-to-face experiences in the world too. Most of all, we are wishing all our listeners around the world strength and courage and compassion with all that you are juggling. We'd love to hear from you. Tweet us using the hashtag EdTechPodcast and BettAsia. Asia was the first region to see the impact of COVID-19 on the education system, including school and university closures. At the time of recording, a record number of 1.54 billion children and youth have been impacted by the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, with 185 countries in Asia, Europe, the Middle East, North America and South America announcing or implementing school and university closures. For online learning and edtech organisations, this has meant a huge surge in demand for services. For example, Chinese provider Yunfao Dao suffered a 2-hour system crash last month after 5 million people took up its offer of free live courses. And Indian provider Byju's has experienced a 60% increase in students using its products since it offered children free access to its app in early March to help offset the impact of school closures. In this episode, we speak to a range of educators and partners in the Asian region to talk about their approach to teaching and learning both before and during the coronavirus crisis. What tools and pedagogies are they utilising to best serve their students in the here and now, and also prepare Asia's youth for the connected digital world in the long term? And just how has coronavirus expedited or frustrated these strategies in the region? You'll also hear about how technology developed to be robust enough to take on one of the harshest environments out there, i.e. space, is being used to support data-intensive remote work and university research, and the mega trends in Asia which are redefining value and identity for education, teaching and learning in the region. But first, the Asia region that we talk about is vast. Asia is the largest continent in the world, both by area and population, and the continent covers an area of over 17 million square miles, made up of 48 countries with a total population of over 4 billion people. So, let's hone in a bit. Who are we talking to this week? First up, Dr. Fridolin Ting, a teaching fellow in the Department of Applied Mathematics at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Brilliant. So I'm excited to be doing this first interview for our next series. So welcome on the line, Dr. Fridolin Ting.
Thank you, Sophie. Great to be here. My honor, to be honest. I am a promoter of and a big believer in active teaching and learning. First, I was born in Malaysia, then I grew up in Canada since I was 7. Long story short, I moved to Hong Kong, and I started teaching, and I noticed the Asian students here were more passive than our North American students back in Canada when I taught there 10 years. Yeah, so I started investigating why and how Asian students, why they performed better when we introduced active teaching methods to them. And because, I was very intimidated every time when I asked a question in my large 200 enrollment class, do you have any questions? And it was completely silent. So I was very, very kind of distraught and didn't know what to do. So that's when I started using technology such as Poll Everywhere, Kahoot. And after that, I noticed like a big change in my students. They started talking more, answering more questions, and getting more involved. So then I decided to see whether this actually helped them actually learn. Doing my research, I ran across this meta-analysis done by Freeman. Basically, it's a study of lots of papers where they basically coded all the active learning papers and their effectiveness on student academic performance. And they showed that on average, for students who were introduced active learning or active teaching in their classes, they performed 6% on average better than relative to the traditional teaching class. And that just, hit the nail for me. I just thought, this is it. We have to try to help our Asian students here in Hong Kong and Asia to be more actively learning and our teachers to be more actively teaching. That's when I started to apply for some funding from the Hong Kong government. They have this teaching and learning funding schemes called Triennium Teaching Learning Projects. And luckily, they like this idea of introducing more active learning to their students with the help, of course, of technology. And all this started rolling, and we started producing apps that actually caught a lot of the teachers' attentions in the world. One of them is YoTeach, and it's been a great journey so far. Very, very fun, I must say. I'm very privileged to be able to help teachers to teach actively around the world.
We also have Chris Jeffrey, Chief Academic Officer at the British University, Vietnam.
Well, my name's Chris, and I am, as you said, the Chief Academic Officer. So what I do is I look after all the academic elements here at BUV, from admissions to teaching to discipline, research, as well as alumni and student experience. So I deal with the whole life cycle, I suppose, of the student and their time here at BUV.
Welcome also to Dr. Sumitra Nair, Vice President at the Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation, or MDEC.
Hi, Sophie. Thanks for having me on this podcast. As you mentioned in the beginning, in the introduction, I oversee the development of talents for all digital and data-related roles. Yeah, because as Malaysia wants to, increase the contribution of the digital technology economic sectors into the GDP, and also with fourth IR and so on, you find that increasingly roles are becoming more digital, and digital is one of the key requirements for jobs of the future. So digital is the first, and the second area I'm interested in is data, because of course with AI and with cloud and connectivity, data is something which is at the fingertips of everyone and is important to all roles, regardless of what area of work you do. And so in my work, what I do is I work closely with like-minded stakeholders from both public and private sectors to build the talent pipeline. And what I refer to here as the pipeline are those who are coming out of schools and universities. And we also work with other partners to facilitate upskilling and reskilling of people who are already in the workforce. And this is to ensure their career continuity.
And finally, Christian Jones, who works on strategy and planning for Z by HP.
It's been an interesting progression day by day over the last few weeks.
And David Hollins, Education Strategy Manager for Asia Pacific and Japan at HP.
It's part of our condition. We're born to learn. We're wired to learn.
To get things started, I asked this week's guests what their thoughts were on education and edtech in the Asian region. David Hollins kicks off with the megatrends which are shaping the region's response to skills development and research focus.
So I guess we're in a really interesting time because we have a whole bunch of sort of megatrends forces, as you describe. And from a HP perspective, I guess from a business perspective, we look at these in terms of shaping or acting as a beacon for how we can sort of direct our research and look into the future and decide where our place might be. So there are four that we sort of identify: rapid urbanization, that's the expansion and proliferation of these mega cities, changing demographics. You know, we're looking at countries that are rapidly aging, so the skew of rather much older people is tipping the pyramid a little bit differently. So in countries like Japan and developed countries, we're seeing a lot more older people in that country making up its population versus younger. Hyperglobalization. So that's that sense that everything's interconnected. And right now we've got maybe a negative example of how where interconnectedness is on a negative side really causing some problems for us. But thinking of it in terms of the potential and the capacity for us to do incredible things. So you see people rise to the challenge right now around COVID-19 in terms of our ability to share ideas. So that sense that we're interconnected like we've never been before. And then finally, putting it all together, accelerated innovation. And so that's that sense that we have so many people who are interconnected, not only in terms of their thoughts, but in different fields and even in different languages. So we could be collaborating and working on problems with people who speak very fundamentally different languages because we have technology in between allowing that facilitation. So rapid urbanization, changing demographics, hyperglobalization, and accelerated innovation, sort of shaping the socioeconomic, demographic, and technological shifts that we're seeing. And so education finds itself right in the mix of that. So you can have a fantastic country with a marvelous healthcare system that's free and well-equipped hospitals. But again, if we don't have enough trained physicians or surgeons, New Zealand at the time was facing sort of an average waiting time for surgery of upwards of 300 days. And that was growing. So this is something that we see in a lot of countries around the world. So this sort of puts up some challenges to the notion of how we train people, for the skills and the knowledge that we need to address these issues. Notably, we've got a whole bunch of, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which 192 nations have signed up to because we're headed towards a whole bunch of challenges, and in some analysis, we'll need, say, 2 Earths worth of resources by 2030. So, of course, we don't have 2 Earths. So we have to start thinking about how do we fill the gap to come up with innovative solutions that is going to sort of paint a picture that's a lot better for our future.
I've got here, you've worked in over 50 countries and you came to Vietnam via London, UK. What would you say are the defining characteristics of education in Vietnam / the Asia region as you see it?
Well, I think one thing is, the major thing is the priority of education and the respect of education from both students and parents. It's really seen as an investment in the future for the family and the individual. So there's a huge amount of effort in choosing the right university and school, and also developing and getting the best possible grades and results from the students after they graduate. So that's a really an interesting and a pleasure to be dealing with. The other thing as an academic is here in Vietnam, we have Teachers' Day every year. And it's a day that students celebrate their teachers. And having been brought up in the UK system, that is a rarity that anybody celebrates officially, teachers and educationalists generally. So it's a very different mindset of the individual, but also the government and business greatly value education and appreciate overtly, I suppose, the benefit for them and their family.
Yeah, I think very important, and I mean, of course, very important is the focus on self-learning and lifelong learning, right? With technologies changing as quickly as it is, these changes are also then impacting industries. Industries are being disrupted, and the skills that are required for these industries are also evolving very, very fast. And so we need to make sure that the workforce, whether it's the current or the emerging workforce, have skills that are relevant and transferable, right, to fit these fast-changing requirements. And so the only way that can happen is if we have a strong self-learning and lifelong learning capability and culture, right? And I think this perhaps is a little bit lacking. In Asia, where the habit of just reading or even lifelong learning is something that we're grappling with. I'm not sure whether it's a situation that's unique to Asia, maybe all over the world. But specifically, I feel it's really important because in Asia, for example, we tend to have a strong focus on academic excellence. And so, people kind of tend to think, all right, I've graduated, I've done my exams, I'm done, I've got a degree or a diploma and I'm set for life. But in this new emerging workforce, that's not going to be enough. So people need to keep learning, and they need to be comfortable with relearning, unlearning, and reinventing their skills as they go. And I think this is where Edtech plays a huge role, because, with Edtech, it's able to cater to individual learnings and preference. So I think that's how Edtech can help. Yeah, the second thing that I think is critical is teacher readiness, right? So for us to ensure that, the emerging workforce at least has this love for learning, lifelong learning, the teaching and learning methods need to be more engaging, and it needs to suit this new emerging generation, as well as suit their current content consumption habits. Like, I mean, if you think about it, when we watch Amazon, whether it's Amazon Prime or, Google Movies or Netflix, what we're doing is, or even Google for that matter, right? Search, what we're doing is we're actually consuming content on demand. And that's not what happens in schools, right? It's a very different, conventional kind of a teaching style. And I'm not sure whether the style that we have actually cultivates this love for learning, or whether it actually dampens the curiosity and the love and the desire to keep learning. I think that's something we've got to think about, and how the teacher can play a role there.
One person who is working directly on all this is Dr. Fridolin Ting. Here he is talking about the problem of passive student engagement in his early lectures.
Yeah, I have to say, the concept of active learning 3 years ago for me was non-existent until I started my project and started really investigating whether, all these Edtech products like Kahoot, Mentimeter, blah, 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 right, actually help students learn. And they do in a sense of active learning. And active learning, without getting into the big details, is anything other than traditional lecturing. There's a whole theory that we've explored in our POMS project to measure active learning and also classify it, define what it is too. But active learning, I found out, according to the World Economic Forum report on future jobs, is like the second most important skill to have in the future. Right? And it's so true because the world is changing so fast. The problems are so big that we need, as a whole society, including our students, to actively learn new ways to collaborate, new solutions, to think up new ways to tackle different problems, to actively learn faster so that we can, help solve some of the most important problems that faces our world now, right? Including the coronavirus, right? So it's a very important thing, not only in society, but also in, like you said, the corporate world, where you want to train your employees in the fastest amount of time. And to do that, you have to actively teach them and not just passively, traditionally, just lecture to them.
And you mentioned funding briefly, but could you tell us a little bit more about how you went from embracing the idea of active teaching learning to getting funding and actually being able to embed this somewhat in your practice?
Right. The scheme and the Hong Kong government is called the Triennium Teaching Learning Funding Schemes. And they do this every 3 years. And they offer up maximum of 50 million Hong Kong dollars to work with, collaborate and work with universities across Hong Kong. In our particular proposal, we're working with 3 other universities. So we're the leading university, Hong Kong Polytechnic, and Chinese U, Hong Kong U, and Baptist U. And basically with some very inspiring educators and friends from all these 3 universities, we decided, hey, we need to teach our students more actively. We need to teach them the skills to compete in the next coming knowledge economy. And so luckily we all got our heads together, we wrote a nice proposal, and we were funded $15 million from Hong Kong. And so at each university, they've made different apps and platforms themselves, which we proposed in our project. And so far we've got over 13 apps, platforms, and active learning pedagogies we've constructed together.
But how have our guests adapted to the world presented to them through the novel coronavirus outbreak? And how long has the kind of on-campus sort of closure been now?
Well, it was after Tet, so that was at the end of February. What was interesting here is that the government allowed universities back for a week, but then there was an upsurge in the number of cases, so they suspended again all education. So we've actually had the situation where we went from face-to-face to online, back to face-to-face for a week, and then back to online.
I've put here, many of our listeners will be currently working out online learning strategies for their schools, colleges, universities or workplaces. Obviously, because of the Hong Kong protests and now coronavirus, and also your underlying interest in active learning pedagogies and face-to-face versus online teaching, you've been immersed in working online for over 4 months. So I just wondered if you had any tips based on your experience and, what you found difficult and what you would recommend for people who are sort of facing this and perhaps moving more online than they have previously?
Oh, good question, Sophie. Yeah, and very relevant now that all of us teachers around the world have to, unfortunately, do this now. Go from face to face to online. But don't worry, Avi. So we had to deal with it 4 months ago, and at first, to be honest, I was also nervous. And what type of platform should I use? What's the pedagogies I should use? The equipment and all that stuff. But basically, to the teachers all out there in the world, just whatever your school platforms offer, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Blackboard Collaborate, Google Meet, etc. Just try your best to, you have to get used to the technology first. And if you're lucky enough to have two different options, just choose the platform that you're most comfortable with. Don't, take any pressure from admin or whatever, but just the one that helps you teach better, okay, and you're most comfortable with. Don't, take suggestions from, anyone else, but what you're comfortable with. That's the most important thing, I think. And the second most important thing is, the students are all having trouble too, not just you, learning online. So you see this, I have a 6-year-old daughter, and, and to the 24-year-old or 21-year-old, 18-year-old university students, they're going to have trouble at first. So try to make it fun and light in the first couple of times, just do something funny, do the floss or whatever. Try to, get them comfortable, and, don't just jump into it and start teaching, and, after you get comfortable, first making sure your camera's on, headphones are on, speakers are fine, and you know how to, turn the pages on your PowerPoint or write on your iPad, projected on the screen. Then, after you get the basics done, then maybe you can try to be more creative and introduce some active teaching methods in online learning. So like basic one is a basic chat, right? Students are going to have questions. Make sure there's a chat at least in the platform you're using. If there's a polling system, that's a bonus. So that's an automatic yes, a good way to collaborate and engage your students. If you can inject some games in there, okay, that'd be great. So I've been using our tool, Badaboom, and other people have been using Kahoot. I use my Yo Teach for the back channel, and then just we're all gonna get through it. Just don't stress over it. That's what I say. So just try your best. We're all having, including like I said, the students. So just try to relax and have fun. That's all I say.
Just to come back to one of your points, you mentioned that perhaps the baseline experience at the moment is, you get your degree and then you think you're set for life. I just wondered, given our current global experience of rapid and massive adjustment in the face of coronavirus, how people locally are perhaps tapping into some of those skill sets that you mentioned would be required in the longer term anyway. So, being able to adapt and being able to adjust how they work or how they learn.
Yeah, I think, there is still some amount of disparity and divide. You find there are pockets of society which are ready. Take the organization I work for, example, Edtech. We've within 12 hours, we kind of jumped onto a completely online learning, online working mode, right? But then there are pockets in the country where either there is insufficient connectivity or just, the lack of the know-how and the familiarity, to get online. So it's not entirely pervasive yet. I would say we still have some ways to go. I mean, it's definitely better than what it was even 3, 4, 5 years ago. But it's not completely. I mean, you mentioned in the beginning before we started the chat, you had spent some time in Sarawak, and so there are parts of remote Sarawak which may not be able to get online. So those things we need to narrow the digital divide, and also to ensure everybody has got a better opportunity to access.
Absolutely. I've put here you spearhead digital technology talent development strategies for K-12 students, tertiary education, and digital upskilling for the existing workforce. And to date, these initiatives have collectively impacted more than 8,000 schools, 16 tertiary institutions, and 800,000 individuals. How have you delivered these skills development programs?
Yeah, I think, from the onset, we had decided that we wanted, whatever we did, we wanted it to be scalable and sustainable. And the only way to achieve this is through collaboration and partnership, right? There's no way any single organization is going to be able to achieve that kind of impact. And I think we've been really lucky to find strong partners here in Malaysia. So on the school side of things, where, here we work closely with the Ministry of Education in Malaysia, and we helped the Ministry of Education to convince decision makers to integrate computational thinking and computer science into the national schools curriculum. Mm-hmm. And ever since we got the buy-in from the top, which was in 2016, my organization has been working really closely with the Ministry of Education to prepare teachers, to teach these new subjects and these new concepts across the country. And that would not have been possible if we didn't have the Ministry of Education support, number one. But number two, it also would not have been possible if we did not have private sector coming on board. So we do also work with quite a few private sector partners, some of the big tech companies, for example, who have come on board to help with, like you have the Microsoft educators, you have the Google, education innovators and so on, who play their role. So they've sort of come on board and said, okay, how do we help to scale this further? So I think there's definitely, stronger with all these other partners on board. So I would say that's the critical success factor. I mean, even with universities, we work closely with the Ministry of Higher Education. And in my previous role, when we used to teach micro businesses digital marketing, we partner with more than 30 organizations that have a focus on entrepreneur development. And so we just developed the module. We even got an off-call certification from the UK. And then we embedded it into these organizations who then train their respective beneficiaries. So it's kind of like a train the trainer model, but it's something that we did definitely hand in hand with partners.
One company working on such partnerships is HP Education. Nielsen recently predicted that streaming is set to rise by 60% during the current global coronavirus pandemic. For many tech companies, this is an extremely pressing time, with unprecedented demand stressing out servers, users, and company execs as they battle to meet the needs of their learners. For heavy data lifting projects, research, and remote work, what could be a good testbed challenging scenario to tackle today's challenge of magnitude, coronavirus? What about space-to-earth comms? Here's Christian Jones, who works on strategy and planning for the Z Central Remote Boost technology by HP, to talk about how it came about.
It is a fascinating story. So at HP, we have a product, Z Central Remote Boost, and in years past, previous generations were called remote graphic software. But even before that, in HP labs, where we keep most of our PhDs contained, sometimes they get out, but in HP labs, we developed some technology that was able to do very low or lossless compression of images. And when NASA was sending their rover Mars missions out and they needed to collect images, they actually came straight to HP Labs and they wanted to get at the source of our image technology, because those images were very precious to them, and they wanted to be able to capture them, keep them without losing the quality, and then transmit them back to Earth. So this the genesis of this project was really using this internal HP Labs codec to transmit images back to Earth. Now, after we had done that, we had also been in the process of productizing it to rethink how people do remote desktops, specifically the engineers, scientists, designers, and even animators at the time who had very graphically rich programs on their screen. And we thought, well, it's kind of like streaming high quality images, but doing so in a very interactive way. And that's how this product that's now Z-Central Remote Boost was born, was for those specialists, those highly graphically intensive applications, but to allow people to remotely connect to them. Not always from space, that one was unique, but maybe from the high-powered computers that they would have in their office or on campus, and do so from home or other locations.
Now, space is one thing, but how does such technology relate to the needs of universities?
Yeah, so right now in this climate of remote working, it's very interesting. The challenge that a lot of universities face is that a lot of the programs, whether it is geoscience, data science, machine learning, or engineering and animation, they have pretty high-powered desktop computers that are filled with a lot of memory, high-powered graphics card to be able to run the professional apps that the students need to become proficient in the real world. And the projects in those apps don't always travel well if you wanted to do it in a laptop or via a Chromebook in a web browser. You actually need that power of that computer. So they're kind of stuck where these computers are now locked on campus and the students aren't able to access them. And that's where this product, Z-Central Remote Boost, has really come in handy. And we've been quite busy trying to support universities over the last month, get their infrastructure set up so that students can be at home with their own devices, but remote into the high-powered computers that have that expensive software and run it, almost as if it was local on whatever mobile device they've got at their home. And so getting the universities set up so they can continue to teach the courses and give the hands-on experience to students in those types of programs has been, a pretty big focus for us the last few weeks.
One thing to remember in the rush to get online and set up distance learning is to consider the pedagogic goal and to consider the most apt technology available. Our guests explain more.
So this is an example. As I mentioned earlier in the interview, there are some parts of Malaysia where connectivity is not as great as we would hope it should be to facilitate online learning and so on and so forth. But many of these areas have television. And so we are now working with one of the satellite TV providers in Malaysia to broadcast video tutorials on things like coding, and software, hardware programming, that sort of thing, right? And so that's the only way to reach out to more people, So rather than we go and ask for funds, it's best to identify each partner for what they can do to complete the picture or to help scale some of these initiatives even further.
Put here, BUV has invested $25 million in blended learning infrastructure, technology, facilities and faculty. Can you talk us through some of the systems you use and what pedagogy this helps to enable?
Well, BUV is a traditional face-to-face university. So the technology was really to supplement what we do in the classroom. And we use Canvas as our virtual learning environment where the lectures are recorded and where faculty can really develop the richness of their subject. We also here at BUV give every new student an iPad and all the textbooks that they need as their reference books for their modules, but also more generally are downloadable and given to them as ebooks. So that technology has enabled us to be fast in terms of changing books, changing the lessons and so forth. And actually it has come to be a godsend really in terms of the pandemic, the coronavirus, where actually overnight we changed from supported face-to-face teaching to online teaching. And we've carried out 1,002 hours of lectures online in the last 5 weeks. So the transition was very smooth. Was it perfect? No. But again, it's a fast learning curve. And the students have really benefited from that, because one of the things that we found is that students like stability. They like to know what is happening. And we've been able to manage that transition from the timetable they had here on campus to the same timetable, just done remotely. So we've been very fortunate to have invested in the technology.
That's really interesting. And are you seeing that the students are turning up to the live lectures, or are they kind of accessing things afterwards?
They're doing both. We've kept our very strict attendance policy. So students still have to attend on time the online lectures, because for us, this is an interim measure while the university is shut for obviously health and safety reasons. So for us, we wanted to maintain that stability. So the students turn up on time. They get to see and participate in the live lecture, because we do it via campus's conference facility. So the lecturer can see them and they can see the lecturer. But then also they can look at the recording later when they're doing their assessments, or if they're revising or recapping on what's been happening.
Well, that's a really interesting point about the students, because I know right at the beginning of the interview you mentioned how intimidating it was to have 200 students, and when you ask a question it's completely silent. And I'm wondering also, from the student perspective, is it very intimidating to have 200 students when you're thinking of asking a question? And I wondered what your thoughts are on whether we can really achieve active learning in a sort of 200 person face-to-face environment, or whether there's other ways to kind of encourage the students to develop some of those skills that you mentioned were needed in the World Economic Forum report. So, you know, I suppose there's a benefit to students feeling confident communicating through technology, but also there's this skill set we need to develop of students feeling confident communicating in person and giving their opinion in public as well.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, Sophie. I mean, we can only do so much when our classes are 200 in size. Yeah, with active learning, right? And developing those skills you're talking about, like confidently expressing ideas and collaborating with other groups of people, right? So in reality, you can only do so much of so much of that skill in a large class. So we try our best with these technologies for sure. But you're right. I don't think we do it at 100% success rate. So in that cases, smaller tutorials are maybe better suited to teach those skills, or one-to-one even, like communicating, one-to-one presenting to a small group of students. But the pedagogies are no matter what size class. And that's why when I was first talking to you, we were talking about your whole goal of the Edtech podcast is to bring together ed and tech. But it should be, ed should go before tech for sure. And it's good that people call it Edtech, because without education, there's no technology. And it's the active learning teaching methods and the strategies, the pedagogies that will have the most influence on giving our students that skill of actually working together, collaborating together, discussing innovative things together, pushing each other, and it's the pedagogy, the peer instruction, the collaborative problem-based learning, the basic question and answer, case-based learning, sometimes game-based learning. It's the pedagogies that will ultimately be the reason why our students will get those skills. And so that's why we as a PALMS project, that's our first word in our PALMS project is pedagogic and active learning. That's the first thing we need to concentrate on. The technology later will be just a supporting mechanism to help the efficacy of implementing those active learning strategies, and will ultimately help our students be active learners.
So, with our guests drawing on many different experiences of education around the world, what do they love about education in Asia versus the rest of the world, and what would they love to see more of? You mentioned previously that what gave you your grey hair was the British education system, not the Vietnamese. So that sounds like a continuation of your last point, probably.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to say Vietnam is not challenging. Vietnam is a complex environment, but also it's a very structured environment. So the bureaucracy is there, but it's very much as though it's building blocks rather than a web of things to do. So I think in that sense, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's more understandable once you understand it. It takes a while to get to understand it, but once you get there, it is quite a logical system, and it doesn't change that much. So it's not the latest fad, the latest initiative. It's the fundamentals that are important here. Policy does change. There have been some very recent new decrees that the government had done on higher education and how universities are governed and so forth. But they are generally fairly simple in structure. Implications and implementation are more complex and happen over time. But I think, again, it's that thing that actually, if you understand the system, if you understand how Vietnam works, it's logical and it doesn't stress you out too much. So you know what's going to happen. You know if there's a new degree, there'll be a period of transition and a period of identifying the major points, and also about how government implements those points across the country. So it's a process. It's not overnight. It's a process where government listens to the stakeholders and will then develop the ways it wants the new decree implemented.
In terms of research, absolutely, universities from the very beginning of the first university, they're well placed to actually investigate challenges facing society and explore ways that we can look at the world, look at these challenges, and come up with solutions. And it's no coincidence that HP sort of began, I guess, its life as an offspring of Stanford University. So what we know is that research is super important, but now we're in a place where universities are wrestling with this challenge around how do we actually, sort of address what is very rapidly moving in terms of different kinds of skills and a mixture of skills. So we're talking about, sort of things that we need in, I guess, human capital development that look a lot different to our historical view of how we'd prepare tertiary education. So traditional degrees are less important, still important, but less important. More important is the ability to produce people who are lifelong learners. So universities are doing a great job right now of trying to challenge themselves and adapt the way they structure courses and curriculum to provide a more agile and balanced sort of study for people But nonetheless, this is not an easy task for most universities placed in the context of national legislation. So there's a lot of work that universities come up against just in terms of the, I guess, the rules and regulations and governance. But certainly they have their eyes fixed on what they need to do.
Absolutely. We hear that a lot in the UK with some sort of new universities that are popping up and trying to be more interdisciplinary and, have a more progressive approach to which students they take on, not always based on traditional assessment, but then what gets recognised as a university with a capital U has to then slot into more traditional forms of regulation. So it's kind of like a catch-22 sometimes. In terms of breaking out of that model. I think what's quite interesting about current circumstances is certainly here in the UK, you're seeing sort of traditionally viewed as quite sluggish, large organisations, whether that's in healthcare or education, suddenly rapidly turn around things with the backing of government, the public, because of the circumstances. So it's allowing people to imagine what's possible, and it'll be interesting to see if it continues.
Absolutely, and Sophie, the nature of our learning is becoming more credential based. So that's this idea that we can find the knowledge and skills that we need in a short space of time. It could be on demand, and then undertake a relatively short period of time of study and acquire those skills and knowledge that we need to undertake a task. And so the devices that we have in our hands every day are a fantastic example of how, without really setting out to do it, we've empowered a whole bunch of people, certainly the three of us on this call, to go out and acquire skills and knowledge that we've needed very practically at the time that we needed it. So not that any three of us are a doctor on this call, but I'm sure that we've all looked up symptoms or investigated a medical condition either for ourselves or for a loved one. And thanks to technology, we have that capacity. So I guess that's a common example where we're now fixing things and learning things in a way which is far more agile. And so universities are sort of at the forefront of investigating this new way of leveraging technology and allowing us to do something really important. So there are two things I always think about in terms of learning that are precious to people. And the first one is that time is probably the most precious of all things that we have in our lives. We have a finite amount of time that we live, so you could measure our lives in terms of hours or minutes. So anything we can do that compresses that attaches value into each and every hour of study is wonderful. And the second piece is it's about location and where we are, where we find ourselves. And that's not just the geographical location, but also in terms of the context of our society, our culture, our family. And so, we're at a really interesting time in history where technology is able to meet us in these moments that would otherwise, not be able to be leveraged for learning because we're not in the right place. We're not in, dare I say it, the right family or the right socioeconomic group. Or cultural group. So I think this is a really exciting place, and one of the most important things that technology needs to do, and certainly HP's focus, is to look at these two factors and really heavily consider how that empowers our research and our direction to assist learning.
And finally, as we record this, news arrives in that China will be going ahead with its famous entrance exam, Gaokao, with a record high of 10.7 million students expected to sit the in-person test, postponed by just a month from its original date. Perhaps some green shoots for the higher education sector globally. Now, before we go, and in this time of need, some resources to help you through these challenging times. Okay, I've got here, what books, resources, people, projects or students are you most inspired by?
Well, I mean, from books, I'm a political junkie and leadership junkie. So one of my favourite is Doris Kearns Goodwin, the presidential historian. And I was actually reading before this crisis, Leadership in Turbulent Times, which kind of actually seems very, very apt, even more apt than it was before the pandemic. So that's my little bit of light relief. Obviously, watching politics and listening to politics occupies a lot of my spare time. But people and students wise, I think I love a challenge. And obviously, it's great when students do fantastically well. And every academic wants to see their students do that. But for me, I think the most satisfying cases are where students who have struggled, who have thought they're going to give up, they can't finish, and through the pastoral side of the job and with colleagues, persuading them, influencing them, supporting them, and then seeing them cross the stage at their graduation, maybe not with the best degree, but with a degree that they know they've earned through their own effort and through all the trials. I have to say that still brings a tear to my eye every single time.
Okay, so I have to say there's 3 books I was most inspired by in my career. First is I was a trained physicist at first. I got a physics undergrad degree. It's called Surely You're Not Joking by Richard Feynman. He was a genius and invented basically the Feynman path. But it's a very light book and it's very funny. It tells a story about a genius who's also like a guitar player. And anyway, the second is called The Idea Factory: Learning How to Think at MIT by Pepper White. Yeah, it basically teaches you how to survive and basically be innovative. It's a great little book. And then kind of technically, I read this book when I was like 14, How to Read and Do Proofs. But basically, it teaches you how to logically work through problems, step by step. It's a math kind of type of book, but really I've applied this even to my teaching projects now, and innovation, design thinking, how to get from one step to another. And, it doesn't work, you go another route and stuff like
Fantastic.
that. Well, people, my PhD supervisors, Michael Siegel, my research collaborators, Zheng Cheng Wei, who's like a genius in partial differential equations, and there's been educational people too. Bill Gates, all those people, just inspire me too. They're really wanting to help the world. It's that's what it's all about, really. What's the point of doing something where we can't help people?
Okay, that's a tough question because I'm inspired by so many different people. But I think, firstly, it's inspired by my team. I'm blessed because I have an extremely hardworking team, and they care. Every day when they show up for work, it's not just for a paycheck, but they come to work because it's a calling, and they bring their best self to work every day, wanting to make a difference in people's lives. So that's what kind of keeps me going. I think secondly, it's the partners that we have, and these partners give their time and their own resources so willingly. They're more like friends. They care deeply about education and skills development in the country. And each of them, these individuals, have taken it upon themselves to convince their corporations to commit to the cause. So, that is inspiring because it just tells me that there are so many people that see the need and are willing to work together. And I think, of course, at the end of the day, the biggest inspiration are the children themselves. In Malaysia, we've met so many students from whether it's rural or other underprivileged backgrounds who come up with, just amazing inventions to solve problems, not just in their community, but even the world. There are kids who are coming up with ideas to address the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example, right? And what they've proven to me is that given the opportunity, all children are geniuses in their own right.
Yeah, look, this field is full of just incredible people, and I'm often talking about these people who are involved in education as being like-hearted, like-minded. So I have the great privilege to work across so many people in many NGOs and organisations, but even on the ground, meeting the students. I had a privilege of being in Mumbai a few months ago last year, and I was visiting a particular institution that takes the most vulnerable students out of Mumbai's biggest slum, and the people that work at the coalface of education, they inspire me. So I think the most powerful thing for me is being in those environments where you see the change happen and you're meeting the people as it's happening. And that for me is sort of the fire in my engine.
So, students like stability, don't recreate the wheel to continue teaching and learning. Engage students where possible with back-end channels, polls and interactivity. The digital divide is very real, so use the tools that best help with access. And pay heed to teacher development and funding opportunities to utilise tech with impact. Just some of the messages from this week's episode. And don't forget, online is amazing, but everything has its limits.
Yeah, so we'd love to help everyone. There are certain circumstances when remoting the screen actually isn't quite enough. And I actually have a brother-in-law who's getting his PhD and doing a lot of neuroscience studies. And he was given his pass as a required worker who's able to be out and about, because he has to keep his lab mice alive, the studies that they're doing. So he's able to still actually go on campus for that. But you're right, there are still circumstances where you probably need to be on site to use it. But for the other ones, the ones with the remote compute, what we've done is anyone that had an HP workstation or Z computer, they already had this for free. And so mostly we were just getting the word out to the universities that had that. And then the change that we did is we gave a 90-day trial license for anybody so that all universities could get through the semester that they're in and just quickly make these programs accessible.
That's all for this week. Thanks so much for listening in, and huge thank you to all of my guests and Bett for supporting this second What Matters in EdTech series, and HP for supporting this episode. In the spirit of knowledge sharing during this time, please do get in touch with what resonated, what you'd like to add, or what you want to hear about in our next episode looking at the Middle East and Africa. You can leave your listener audio message for inclusion at speakpipe.com/the EdTech podcast. To continue the conversation online, use the hashtag EdTech Podcast and BettAsia, or go to the Twitter accounts at Podcast EdTech or at Bett_show on all the social medias. Or, for all the show notes, including resource and reading recommendations, it's theedtechpodcast.com. And for more content, check out the BettAsia website, where you can find out more about how to stay connected with the community. Have a great week.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for the invitation. It's been a privilege to speak to you today.
It's been my absolute pleasure, Sophie, and thank you so much for inviting me to do a podcast.
Now I know what gift to bring everyone in the UK when we come back, which is toilet roll, which is in good supply here. There is no rush on toilet roll in Vietnam. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.